Yeah, okay. Nice to see so many people here tonight. We're really happy about that. Welcome to you all. And especially welcome to Dan Klein, who's an associate professor here at Ratio and also a professor of economics at George Mason University. And he's going to speak about Adam Smith. I think we'll give you like 45 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, it might take more.
Okay. Sure. And after that, we'll just conclude with questions and everything. I don't know if you want me to be the moderator during the...
Probably not, but yeah.
Probably better. And also, I should just remind you that it would be good if you could turn off your cell phone since we're filming this, actually, so just to avoid interferences. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you, Ratio. Thank you, Star Academy alumni. Thank you, Swedish-Austrian Circle. Adam Smith, an overview of his work and vision. I have not been there. I guess it's in Edinburgh. Anyway, what that says on there is this. Here are deposited the remains of Adam Smith, author of The Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations. His birthday's coming up. Let's try to celebrate it. A letter by Samuel Romilly said that Smith always considered his Theory of Moral Sentiments as a much superior work to his Wealth of Nations. I'm going to focus on TMS. I think it provides the sort of ethical plexus or ethical framework or ethical sensibility within which we should see this one. But we will get to that one later. From the 4th edition, this was the full title. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, or an essay towards an analysis of the principles by which men naturally judge concerning the conduct and character first of their neighbors and afterwards of themselves. All this from here was added from the 4th edition and remained through the 6th edition. It's actually unfortunate that when Liberty Fund reprinted, or rather I should say when the Glasgow edition was created, that they didn't include this on the title page. They clearly should have. I don't really understand why. But I think it's really worth looking at this. He's giving us a theory of moral sentiments, an essay towards an analysis of the principles. It sounds very scientific. And it raises a question, what should we see as Smith's highest project? What did he see himself pursuing? And one answer to that is a science of man. That's the answer that Nicholas Phillipson offers in his recent and excellent biography of Adam Smith, A Science of Man. I think, however, you can make a case that Smith is as much interested in a culture of liberty or in a liberal civilization. Now, one way to promote a liberal civilization might be to offer a so-called science of man, but I still think I'm still inclined more towards the culture of liberty. And notice that in here we have the principles by which men naturally judge. Naturally appears a lot in Smith's writing, and you can kind of, as it were, slip a lot in there. It's not just about how men judge, but how men naturally judge. And when you're not doing it the right way, it's not natural. So this is this issue I just raised. You know, I don't think it's so clear one way or the other, but I kind of tend towards this interpretation. Now, at first glance, it does not seem to be about politics, this book. Principles by which men naturally judge concerning the conduct and character, first of their neighbors and afterwards of themselves. It's about us and our neighborhood, about us and our equals and peers and associates, how we judge of each other and of ourselves. It doesn't say anything about politics, statesmen, governing. Nonetheless, I think that it's actually a quite libertarian or liberal book. I think the key ideas impart a message of liberty, voluntarism, and the degovernmentalization of social affairs. I see that almost as like the real deeper ballast message of Adam Smith's work, and indeed David Hume's work as well. Again, I think it offers the broad ethical umbrella for wealth of nations. So we're going to peek inside, and on a number of points, I want to talk a little bit about, well, what Smith meant by them, and play up basically this kind of liberal interpretation. You should be warned, as many of you know, I'm sort of a robo-liberal, so it's natural that I would read Smith this way. Now, this is a picture I drew for another essay, and this spiral, you might call the spiral of the self. And let me explain this before I get into this thing about Smith. It doesn't show so well, but the idea here is that there's a sort of dialectic of the self. Maybe you'll find that this speaks to you. Sort of in the moment, there's the engaged self or impulse doing its thing. But you often find that there are, in fact, multiplicities of these, and selves or impulses in conflict. Like, should I really go to that lecture tonight, for example? And this side sort of leads to a sort of conflict or disintegration of the self. But then there's a tendency towards integration and coping with the different impulses, making a bargain, making a balance, okay? Towards a more composed, enduring self. But once you master that, you again, you know, it gets boring, right? You got to keep things interesting. You're going to mess things up for yourself to make sure. And you're going to think about, well, gee, maybe I could do other things as a more composed, enduring self. Should I be an economist? Should I marry this person? Should I stay married to this person? And again, there's this kind of disintegration leading to trouble and conflict, and then again, the natural tendency, you hope, towards integration. And in principle, this goes on and on. It's not, the point is not that you get to some happy bliss point. The soul here is some unreachable limit, ultimately. So you've got a kind of disintegration side and a reintegration side. And I think that this dialectic of the self, if you will, speaks naturally to two sets of virtues Adam Smith sets out, and it making a kind of ecology of sympathy. Suppose Jim is the person principally concerned, and Mary is entering into Jim's situation, hearing about Jim's day, Jim's troubles. The two sets of virtues relate to the two sides of this spiral, but are played in this story by Jim and by Mary. The amiable virtues are what call to Mary in entering into Jim's troubles, okay? And understanding that we're all human, life is fragile, Jim's got problems, being compassionate, sympathetic, indulgent. That's Mary's role here in entering into to find sympathy with Jim. But at the same time, Jim can't ask too much of Mary. He's got to pull himself together, right? And he's asking Mary essentially to help him pull himself together, because you always want to kind of move up. If you think of this as a spiral coming out, you can kind of think of needing both sides to go higher as a human being. And the idea is always to go around. It's kind of like a yin and yang kind of thing. So Jim's side is over here to pull himself together enough so that Mary's able to enter into his situation and sentiments. So I just want to read, he says, upon these two different efforts, Mary's and Jim's here essentially, upon that of the spectator to enter into the sentiments of the person principally concerned, Jim, and upon that of the person principally concerned, to bring down his emotions, this would be Jim, to what the spectator can go along with, are founded the two sets of virtues. The soft, the gentle, the amiable virtues, the virtues of candid condescension and indulgent humanity, are founded upon the one. The great, the awful, and respectable, the virtues of self-denial, of self-government, and of that command of the passions which subjects all the movements of our nature to what our own dignity and honor and the propriety of our own conduct require, take their origin from the other. That's the respectable virtues. So he's got this kind of two sides of the human beings. This comes quite early in the book. And it is by being good at entering into, when you're on that side, and being good at kind of pulling yourself together, showing enough dignity to enable people to enter into, that we share our lives and experience and find this sympathy, okay? And the more that we do this, the more that we can kind of develop a rich, composed self, okay? And it's an onward process. Now, he says that this is one of the most important thing to us is the love of those we live with. What reward is most proper for promoting the practice of truth, justice, and humanity? The confidence, the esteem, and love of those we live with. That is the reward. Humanity does not desire to be great, but to be beloved. It is not in being rich that truth and justice would rejoice, but in being trusted and believed. Recompenses which those virtues must almost always acquire. So he believes that the reward is there, the incentives are right, as it were, and indeed this whole theme of the sentiments or love of those we live with is again a central thing in Smith. He thinks at the end of the day, that's probably the cardinal matter of your spiritual well-being. And there's an invisible hand he's asserting here. Now, this picture captures some of these elements. I made this picture with the help of a graphic artist. This is the two sides of the amiable and respectable virtues. By the way, he genders them a bit, and even explicitly. And the amiable is more female, and the respectable is more male. And so this is actually a woman's face here. They together form a sort of man in the breast, a judge, a conscience. And the way this works is that for your amiable virtues, you need to deploy those to enter into the situations of people affected in some matter. It could be some neighborhood matter, but for that matter, it could be some economic policy matter, like, say, the minimum wage. How are people affected by this? Well, you need to kind of imagine situations like, okay, how is Michael actually affected when they raise the minimum wage? This happens, that happens. Does it really matter? How much does it affect Michael? How much does it hurt him, hold him back, advance him, and so on? And again, it's sort of the amiable and, if you will, female virtues that go there. And you do that for the different parts. So each of these people are a part. And each is a kind of different aesthetic narrative and experience. And you enter into this and you enter into that. And you try to know or sense or imagine. But of course, it's not a part that you're ethically responsible for. It's the whole. And there you kind of turn your back on each of the parts and make judgments, as it were, about the whole. Judgments that somehow aggregate the parts, okay? There is social aggregation. There is, holism of a sort here, and judgment about sacrifices and costs and benefits. And you develop a sense of judgment about different issues, and you discuss that with other people here. And this is, as it were, one figure that we might evoke or invoke in our discussions. Maybe this is Milton Friedman here on YouTube, and we point to that. And we try to absorb it, learn from it, and indeed improve upon it, okay? And so these points would be other sort of steps, as it were, hopefully upward, that build on this. And the limit of this is Smith's idea of the impartial spectator. This sun is the impartial spectator. This is not the impartial spectator. This is the impartial spectator. And the sun is universal. The impartial spectator is universal. It's the same for all of us. It's not your conscience, the impartial spectator. Rather, the impartial spectator would be sort of like your conscience's conscience. Or actually, to be more accurate, your conscience's 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 ... conscience. And furthermore, your conscience's 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 ... conscience is the same in Smith as my conscience's 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 ... conscience. See, it is actually it's a ground rule for ethical conversation, okay? But this construct, which he's sort of saying we enter into or should enter into as the way we think about it, is very much like a monotheistic God, okay? Which we aspire to. Now, when I say it's universal, I just want to caution you that while it's universal, what it surveys is very particularistic, and as it were, sees this complex branch and trees, if you like, of different points and moments in history. And so it's actually surveying a very complex tree structure which acknowledges the historical differences and historical situations. So it doesn't say that, like, oh, you never steal a loaf of bread. You know, in particular historical situations and circumstances, you do steal the loaf of bread. And the impartial spectator even smiles at that, because the branches are, but the idea is universal. And it's this common search towards a standpoint that is common to us. Our characterizations themselves, like how I think it works and how you think it works, those are going to be different. We're going to discuss that. But since we have a common search, we come together in sympathy, as it were, to explore that. And he hopes and asks develop that. So you can now there's one or two other things about this picture. In going up here, it's real important to realize that, you know, this vision, especially when you get to the minimum wage, is very poor. Milton Friedman doesn't see Michael and how he's affected by the minimum wage. He's got some stories, some experience, some data, some this and that. He's going on some impressions, and he forms judgment. And one of the most important things in the vision here of this amiable side is the preceding judge, is the theory and the judgment you learned from somebody else. And that is, you know, as important the sympathy that you build on, because you trust it in certain ways and you test it in certain ways. And so it's like, so you see, for Smith, our sympathy with the man in the breast, okay, which is like this. This is the man in the breast, which is the representative of the impartial spectator. This is the impartial spectator. This is a representative of the impartial spectator. Our sympathy with this is where he puts so much moral approval. And this, by the way, is one way in which I think he very importantly develops on David Hume. David Hume's sympathy in utility was a sympathy directly with these people, which is a lot harder thing to actually sustain, because it's so hard to actually see Michael out there when the minimum wage goes up. And for Smith, it's more clearly focused on a sympathy with this man in the breast, or this supposed judge who surveys the scene. Smith actually makes a big point of that development on Hume. Okay, any questions about that before? It gives you some feeling. Onward. Okay. Active moral agency awakens our humanity and exercises our virtue. This is an interesting moment, pretty famous in Smith, where he goes through two thought experiments involving, well, an earthquake in China and your pinky. He says, this is the first thought experiment, passive sentiment. Let us suppose that the great empire of China with all its myriads of inhabitants was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake, and let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would be affected upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all, express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many reasonings concerning the effects which this disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these humane sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion with the same ease and tranquility as if no such accident had happened. The most frivolous disaster which could befall himself would occasion a much more real disturbance. If he was to lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight. But provided he never saw them, he will snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 millions of his brethren. So that's the passive thought experiment. And he's examining what those passive sentiments are like in the alternative experiences of learning of the earthquake and knowing you got to have your pinky chopped off tomorrow for God knows what reason. And one clearly looms much larger to this guy than the other. But notice how the balance seems different when you change the thought experiment to active agency. To prevent, therefore, this paltry misfortune to himself, would a man of humanity be willing to sacrifice the lives of 100 millions of his brethren, provided he had never seen them? So with that little sentence, he's created this thought experiment, which by some unspecified fantastical mechanism, by cutting off your pinky, you prevent the earthquake, okay? Human nature startles with horror at the thought, and the world, in its greatest depravity and corruption, never produced such a villain as could be capable of entertaining it, okay? So it's here, so it's vastly different now. Now, the guy clearly steps up and cuts off his pinky when he has active moral agency. Whereas here, losing the pinky seemed more of a loss of utility, certainly a lot more, troubling than the earthquake. And he asks, and it's interesting the way he asks the question, but what makes this difference? When our passive feelings are almost always so sordid and so selfish, how comes it that our active principles should often be so generous and so noble? So he then addresses that question, and he goes on to talk about this, okay, about how we would lose the sympathy of the man in the breast if we did not cut off our pinky when it was up to us, okay? And that's, we gather ourselves. It's very much in the respectable virtues kind of thing, no crying about your pinking. It's time to, buck up and do what you got to do. And that's his answer, essentially. It's very eloquent how he goes into it. But notice, and this is sort of the point I want to play up in a libertarian way, he asks, how is it when our passive feelings are almost always so sordid and so selfish, how comes it that our active principles so often so generous and so noble? And this is a theme that appears elsewhere in the book. And I think it speaks a lot to, again, the issue of governmentalizing social affairs and degovernmentalizing them. Take schooling. Now, you guys, my daughter goes to a private school thanks to Swedish school vouchers, thanks to your brilliant understanding of the active principles and the noble and generous sentiments and passions that it evokes. But the rest of the world is not so enlightened, such as the U.S., and kids are pretty much sent to a local government school, and the whole experience is extremely passive. And we know all about the collective action problems and the fighting over resources and so on, but furthermore, there's a whole sort of, as he puts it, sordid and selfish ethos, okay, or culture that surrounds the government, the socialist school system. And I think it's a perfect application of this when people are actually choosing their own schools, choosing to support them with their own, if not their own dollars, their own vouchers, which become, in a sense, their own dollars, deciding which school their kid's going to go to, and those schools are privately owned. That's even better, and you have people with those active responsibilities for a school they call theirs. And I think that principle applies quite broadly, that it's in a degovernmentalized state of social affairs that we are more often called upon to exercise and practice our active principles, which are so noble and so generous. This is a point in Smith which is not brought out that much, and is not discussed. You know, people say, oh, invisible hand and market mechanism, but there's actually a lot of this. So you see in the pinky story, he says you got to cut off your pinky, and I totally agree. By the way, I had an interesting dispute with a Randian scholar about this. I could tell you about that later, but his ethic is universal benevolence. Make no bones about that. Okay, and us, we individualists, so-called, have stumbled over this too often. It is universal benevolence that is sort of the ultimate ethical standard. Don't ask me exactly what that means. He even says it's loose, vague, and indeterminate, but still. In the pinky case, by some fantastical assumed mechanism, you knew that losing your pinky would save people. And that's why, you know, that's not a very normal thing that happens, right? And he says, and then he goes into the whole reality about serving universal benevolence, and he makes the big knowledge point that we generally lack the knowledge to make our benevolence effective when we get much past the local. There is no mechanism about your pinky in an earthquake, for sure. However, the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, one much more suitable to the weaknesses of his powers and the narrowness of his comprehension, the care of his own happiness. And this is kind of an ordered list here of that of his family, of his friends, his country. That he is occupied in contemplating the more sublime can never be an excuse for his neglecting the more humble department. So despite, you know, his favoring chopping off your pinky under those unusual circumstances, he's authorizing us to focus on the local and to focus, in a sense, on our own happiness in the extreme, because that is a part of universal happiness. You know, if we all do our own laundry, the world's laundry is well done. And this relates very much to his emphasis on commutative justice. This is like liberal or libertarian justice. If you like, it's like Rothbardian justice, property, consent, and contract. The most sacred laws of justice, therefore, those which violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and possessions, and the last of all come those which guard what are called his personal rights or what is due to him from the promises of others. So it's very much a sort of person, property, consent idea of justice, which he puts a tremendous weight on. But something to keep in mind here. But before, I'm sorry. So this, he clarifies later and introduces this term, commutative, abstaining from what is another's, not messing with other people's stuff. That's like this big central ethic for not just Smith, actually a lot of the more classical liberal Enlightenment figures, I would say. And you see it in Carmichael, Hutcheson, you see it in Hume, you see it in Smith, so it's a mainstay in the Scottish Enlightenment. To be distinguished from distributive justice, the becoming use of what is our own. And this means like Daniel's own, okay? And he affirms this, and I affirm this. We've stumbled over this word too. Daniel's practicing distributive justice is Daniel making a becoming use of what is Daniel's own. That's what Smith means by this. It's a kind of libertarian distributive justice because his idea of ownership is a libertarian configuration of ownership. He's not talking about the becoming use of the society's becoming use of what is the society's own. That is not what he means by this. And so he's got these two kinds of justices. The one, commutative, is like a grammar, and he makes the analogy to a grammar where its rules are precise and accurate and indispensable, and it is only negative in the sense that feedback on your actions here is only negative. You know, when you turn in a paper for a class and your grammar is perfect, your teacher doesn't like say, great job, your grammar was perfect, you're terrific. You only get feedback on grammar when it's wrong. And that's the same thing with commutative justice. You don't get any awards for not messing with other people's stuff. But if you don't obey that, you get slapped. Bad, negative. So this is only negative. Whereas this and the associated other kind of justice, which I won't bring up here, is in the range of the loose, vague, and indeterminate. And we go based on our community. Our community has some sense of performance here or standard, and our community is community I. And the middle or mediocrity of that is propriety. So with community I comes a propriety I in a certain mode of generosity, fortitude, temperance, whatever the case may be. And what is above propriety I in community I is praiseworthy, and what is below is blameworthy. But this is a loose, vague, and indeterminate standard. It varies with communities, and even within the community, it'll be disputed. This can be positive or negative. And he said that among equals, only this should have the force of law. This is something which should arise, be enforced, pursued, worked out voluntarily. Among equals, anyway. And does he allow the government or the superior to sometimes do more than enforce CJ, commutative justice? The answer is yes. See, he says that this reverence for CJ is among equals. So you can think of the equal to equal relationship where this is like an absolute grammar, virtually. I mean, I'm sure that in some really exceptional circumstances he'd smile on you're stealing the bread, but basically in any kind of normal thing, it's like an absolute grammar. Whereas in the superior-inferior relationship, he does not say the superior is obliged to absolutely respect people's stuff, to respect CJ. He says, I'm not saying that. Sometimes the superior has to force people to give things to other people, to do certain things that is basically coercive. But he doesn't, he says it's very short, it's one paragraph, and it ends with a warning of don't ever take this too far. and he's basically like saying, I'm acknowledging it, but the emphasis here is that we want to respect CJ among equals. After all, it's a society of equals that we're after, okay? He doesn't put it that way, but this is clearly the underlying message, I think, of the book, that he wants this relationship to prevail in society as much as possible and to minimize this. There's clearly a very strong presumption against the superior messing with people's stuff, but he doesn't say it's an absolute grammar when it comes to the superior. Does that make sense? Okay. So we've talked some about an invisible hand in morals. That is, whether virtue has an upper hand in the culture, in the moral ecology, of succeeding and prospering and prevailing and spreading. And he affirms this very clearly for most of society. He says, let's see now. He says, in the middling and inferior stations of life, the road to virtue and that to fortune, to such fortune at least as men in such situations can reasonably expect to acquire, are happily in most cases very nearly the same. In all the middling and inferior professions, real and solid professional abilities joined to prudent, just, firm, and temperate conduct can very seldom fail of success. And he elaborates some on that. He says, the success of such people, too, almost always depends upon the favor and good opinion of their neighbors and equals. And without a tolerable, regular conduct, these can very seldom be obtained. The good old proverb, therefore, that honesty is the best policy, holds in such situations almost always perfectly true. In such situations, therefore, we may generally expect a considerable degree of virtue, and fortunately for the good morals of society, these are the situations of by far the greater part of mankind. These are the situations of by far the greater part of mankind, and there we do find this invisible hand, essentially in this society of equals. Next paragraph. In the superior stations of life, the case is unhappily not always the same. In the courts of the princes, in the drawing rooms of the great, where success and preferment depend not upon the esteem of intelligent and well-informed equals, but upon the fanciful and foolish favor of ignorant, presumptuous, and proud superiors, flattery and falsehood too often prevail over merit and abilities. And he goes on about this. He talks about how their culture, the superior culture, even despises the good, healthy virtues of sort of equal or regular culture. And he goes on. In many governments, the candidates for the highest stations are above the law. And if they can attain the object of their ambition, they have no fear of being called to account for the means by which they acquired it. So again, he's clearly seeing an invisible hand here, or if you like, here. Not an invisible hand here in morals and culture. Speaking, he doesn't say it in this book, because this book is supposed to be about neighbors and yourself. But what he's saying is, let's not have society organized this way. Let's have it organized that way. Okay? That's like the strong libertarian theme, message of I think, Smith and people in his tradition. Within the society of equals, he even talks about what a pleasure it is to work out these morals. The great pleasure of conversation in society, besides, arises from a certain correspondence of sentiments and opinions, from a certain harmony of minds, which, like so many musical instruments, coincide and keep time with one another. But this most delightful harmony cannot be obtained unless there is a free communication of sentiments and opinions. Again, when you have a superior with the power of incarcerating you or forbidding you from selling your pharmaceutical product or prohibiting you from entering a profession, you do not have a free communication of sentiments and opinions. And the moral feeling of it's very different. Now he, at the end of, towards the end, he actually breaks out 4 different sources or moments of this sympathy with a spectator in judging of an action. Say Jim takes an action that affects Mary. And I'm not going to go through these in detail, but the first source is our regard for Jim's motives and intentions. The second is our regard for Mary's sentiments, or in fact, what we feel Mary's sentiments should be, although Mary's real actual sentiments may very much help inform that. A third is our regard for whether the interaction conforms to rules and expectations suitable to the situation. That's something about traditions and customs and expectations, which is important. And I should say that Smith does not offer any way of reconciling or aggregating these 4 different tests of the goodness of Jim's behavior. But this last one is very important and I think often plays a redemptive role. And that is, and last of all, when we consider such actions, maybe Jim is building a brand new cotton mill. And last of all, when we consider such actions as making a part of a system of behavior which tends to promote the happiness either of the individual or of the society, they appear to derive a beauty from this utility not unlike that which we ascribe to any well-contrived machine. This throws it wide open to the happiness of either the individual, Jim himself, or the whole society. This throws it wide, whereas these were Jim's motives, Mary's reaction, neighbors, the customs and established rules for such activity. This one throws it wide open to consider consumer surplus, competition, lower prices, innovation. This one throws it wide open. And see, all of these different sources are practices of this, okay? And this last one is trying to look at, really from 1,000 feet up of the very wide consequences. And he knew that people needed a lot of help here, and that people were not judging this so well. Law of Yanta, you know what I'm talking about. And so that's why he has to help instruct people at the 4th source, and that's why the Wealth of Nations, okay? It becomes Smith's moral authorization for the pursuit of honest profit, and indeed a presumption of liberty in politics and policymaking, coming from this guy who was cultural royalty, who established himself in 1759 with a theory of moral sentiments. This had a lot of moral force, okay? He was the first among his peers in Scotland, and Scotland was one of the mountain peaks in European culture. So this is cultural royalty authorizing these 2 things in a way they've never been authorized before, and bang, we get the Industrial Revolution, which is the theme of Deirdre McCloskey's book, new book, Bourgeois Dignity. It's that the chief cause of the Industrial Revolution was this moral authorization. Now Jim went off and eagerly built his cotton mill. And he wouldn't let anyone shame him about it. He didn't feel guilty about it. In fact, he read this and he felt proud about it. He saw that his way, maybe his best way, to advance universal benevolence was to make as much profit with his cotton mill as he possibly could. And then also this whole theme in policymaking, and that of course gave rise to the liberal era, which lasted a while. Okay, so we've said that. So this, the invisible hand, I think of it as the comparative merit of a system of decision making that respects commutative justice. Again, that's abstaining from what is another's, not messing with other people's stuff, and that is likewise respected by others, including the government. That is a system of decision making that is decentralized or free. mind you that Smith was not axiomatic about this. His commitment to the liberty principle was not airtight. He allowed of exceptions, that style of reasoning, which said a principle is not destroyed just because we acknowledge exceptions, is very strong in the Scottish Enlightenment. I've seen it in, again, in just several of the main figures, Hutcheson, Stuart, Hume, Smith. And indeed, there are even interventions which he condones. These are some of them. I think this side of Smith is extremely interesting. It's a matter of a great deal of discussion. I think there are different ways of kind of reading all this. I do think that there was some fudging going on by Smith. He was culturally royal, and he would have us believe that his culture gets things right. It gets things right in electing leaders of their culture, like me, Adam Smith. And, well, gee, I guess it also gets these right. These were all status quo interventions at the time. And so it was only status quo interventions at the time that he sort of condoned. And sometimes that endorsement is overstated, I think, by some people writing on Smith. But it was not axiomatic, as it should not be. And I won't read that, but that's a famous statement about natural liberty. And there's a whole bunch of statements in The Wealth of Nations where Smith is clearly pounding the fist for liberty, where he's not hedging and fudging. He's not tiptoeing around the status quo. Sometimes he does pound the fist about most sacred property, about natural liberty, about what an outrage many of these laws that he objected to were. And that's all for my presentation. I hope so we have some time for questions. That's okay. I don't believe in it. I do believe that there is a real big difference in sort of the tone of it. That's true. And you know, I think the word sentiment appears twice, if I'm remembering this right, twice in The Wealth of Nations, and the word sympathy zero times. There's almost none of those musical metaphors and synchronous metaphors in The Wealth of Nations. It's really quite extraordinary. What a shift of tone it is. In a way, I mean, let me offer you a kind of crazy answer. In TMS, he's talking about this impartial spectator dialectic and construct and how you do this and being amiable. But it's almost like in The Wealth of Nations, he's just writing as the impartial spectator. And you know, he's just so far out there that he's not, you already know, you've already climbed all these that, you know, I've already covered how this is built upon this amiable entering into. And now we're making these judgments, and so in a way, I think it's like he's like assuming the voice of this remote, impartial spectator, as though like you should have read my other book. And no, but so I don't see any deep. I certainly don't see any deep contradiction between the two in terms of doctrine. Or what do you think about that? Do you have thoughts about that?
I don't know.
My inclination, first of all, I have to admit that there does seem to be a somewhat different portrayal of what people are interested in and what's most important to them. I admit that there's some discrepancy, but I would also suggest, I think, that he's actually talking also about the same thing in two different ways. And when he talks about self-interest, it's not so much that those interests are selfish, it's just that knowledge of those interests, specification of those interests, are of his knowledge and not ours. Self-interest is like an unspecified interest that he knows about and we don't, and maybe it's the love of those he lives with. But as far as we can tell, he just wants to get his bread at the cheapest price. So I'm also inclined to think that way about it, that it's not so much a different portrayal as a different way of talking about the same thing. I think it's more universal by construction. And, you know, it would be universal over, as it were, two nodes of the tree that didn't even have connections with each other in terms of the agents in those different societies. You know, it's like in Battlestar Galactica, maybe you have to save, you know, this species and kill that species or something, and you've got that problem, even though they're not mixing. So it's by construction a kind of universal, like what would we actually do and how would we justify it? And let's work it all out. Does that?
Yeah, but isn't it sort of self-explanatory then, or tautological? Then, if it's universal by construction and you don't deduct it from anywhere, then it's, I mean, then the impartial spectator can be anything that it has to be to fit the description.
Yeah. Well, we mere mortals only have characterizations, and that's what we discuss. We don't have access or any way to jump to this limit out here. I mean, just by the nature of being human, we would always be like inventing new refinements and problems and values anyway. So
is that a sort of secular description of God, or something?
Yes, yes. I like to be fair to the idea that Smith is fairly religious, like he kind of acts sometimes. But I incline more to think that if he had any notion of God, it was a very remote, like once, you know, way before evolution or whatever, God created the metachlorians and, you know, left it all alone, and he hasn't come back and, you know, checked in on us ever since or something like that. So yeah, I think he's basically like Hume in really kind of being fed up with theology. And Hume obviously really went at that and got into trouble for it of all sorts. There was persecution in the Straussian sense very clearly in the society. Hume did not get appointments he would have wanted, and he had big battles, and even with, you know, the Scottish Enlightenment people like Thomas Reid who were writing against Hume. So yeah, I do think it's kind of a secular, if you like, to want to call it that, surrogate. But, you know, it doesn't start with the Bible. It doesn't start with the Decalogue, you know, the Ten Commandments or whatever. It's like you never get, actually, to the impartial spectator. And he's participating in it. You know, here's Milton Friedman on YouTube, and here's Adam Smith. And here's us. The fish. Well, that we've superseded. You want to hear about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a debate between Jim Otteson and Yaron Brook. Jim Ottison's a terrific Smith scholar, and I highly recommend his work on Smith. And Yaron Brook is head of, what's it, the Rand Institute, the Objectivist Institute, I'm not quite sure what the name of it is in New York. And they had a debate at the API conference, and I followed up an email about this. And I said, because, you know, Yaron was saying selfishness and whatever, Rand talk. And, and I said, so tell me something. Would you cut off your pinky? And he didn't answer, but someone else associated with him did. And said, no, I wouldn't cut off my pinky. And had some rationale for that. And I thought that was, you know, telling. And one of my friends and colleagues, said, you know, this is a good example of Neera Bhadwar, Larry White's wife. Neera's a philosopher, and actually very influenced by Rand. But she totally took my side on this because there were some comments, and she said, this is a good example of someone being a victim of their own bad philosophy. I thought the more obvious thing for the Randian to say was, yes, I would cut off my pinky, but it's selfishness. That, you know, it's like, you know, selfishness. Yeah, it's because I wouldn't have this sympathy or something. But that's just, you know, selfish is clearly a pejorative term. I mean, if Randians want to somehow overcome that, I think that's ridiculous. The language makes it a pejorative. You're too selfish. I mean, selfish implies too, sort of partial to yourself. And cutting off your pinky would not be selfish. And that's what I kind of thought it would be. But the person actually said, no, I wouldn't cut off my pinky. And then when I saw Yarn Brook later, he also told me he wouldn't cut off his pinky, which, well, that you judge for that.
Well, about saying
You
no
would,
to the
so you would say you'd cut off your finger and you would defend it as selfishness.
yeah.
Well, I think that's just
In line-
silly
in
silly
line-
use of the word selfish, I have to say. It's,
Well, Ayn Rand said that was selfish. She would take the bullet for her husband because she didn't want to
Well-
live with herself, having not taken the bullet and being without her husband. That was her.
okay, but I think that an example like this one, the earthquake, makes the point even better. I don't know how she would answer. Do you think she'd cut off her pinky?
I don't know. Sort of you spoke about like exceptions, and I seem to recall like a quote from Ayn Rand saying that morale is not created in emergencies and stuff like that. That you can't. I figured that would be a way to get for the Randian
Yeah, that's-
out of that situation, just to say that you can't derive any true morale from.
Yeah.
situation.
What is it? Bad extreme cases make bad law or something like that.
Something like that.
I think that's kind of a dodge.
Yeah, probably is, but
I mean, you know, it's hypothetical, and these things could be meaningful, just like trolley car examples can be meaningful, even though they're fantastical, even. And look, and then there was a question of, well, you know, how extensive are the exceptions? And at least you're opening yourself up to exceptions. Just to say, oh, it applies 100% to the cases in which it applies, right? That's a very proud 100% claim. The point of Smith and actually this whole tradition, which I really like, is, look, it's whatever, 90-something%, and that's still good enough to be a principle. It's good enough for a presumption, okay? We are in a culture of negotiation, and we should be joining power. It shouldn't just be like about, ooh, those terrible government people, and ooh, you know, they're evil and whatever. It's about participation and negotiation, but you can still uphold principles as presumptions, which mean that the guy who's defending some exception bears the burden of proof, just like the presumption of innocence, right? We should have a presumption of liberty. I mean, seriously, that's what a liberal civilization should be about, is a presumption of liberty. And if you're going to favor, support an exception to that, like the minimum wage, like pre-market approval in drugs, like drug prohibition, I feel that you should bear the burden of proof. You should feel obliged to bear the burden of proof, even, and I would say, even when it is the status quo. Although I have to admit that the status quo itself also enjoys a certain presumption. And I mean, it enjoys a very strong presumption, too strong. But I would even say that it deserves some presumption, the status quo, but it's way too much. But it shouldn't be zero, the presumption of the status quo. And the presumption of liberty should go up a lot. So you have, you know, yeah. And this is also, this whole thing, of course, as we were talking about earlier, gets also into, there's a lot of parallel to debate about Austrian economics and whether it's 100% and categorical, or whether we have presumptions, okay, and verities that are by and large, which I think is the much more Hume-Smith way of doing it. Yeah, I do think there's an element of that. I think that he, to some extent, understated his commitment to the liberty principle. Now, it's not that he was 100% and he acted it was 90%. I think it's more like it was 94% and he acted like it was 90%. Something like that, if you will. So it's not like a sharp divergence in a Straussian way where, you know, a guy is justifying God and he's really an atheist, or he's really justifying atheism between the lines. That's kind of the more of a Straussian, typical Straussian story. I would certainly say, yes, he suggests optimism that way, and even a kind of universal. There is a sense in which I think he's talking about contexts like his society. He talks about whether custom and fashion. This is part 5. How big an influence custom and fashion can have, and whether they can like profoundly pervert the moral structure of society. And he says that they can lead to very different proprieties in certain matters, and even in particular usages, really ones at variance from others like ours. And he talks, for example, about infanticide, where it was tolerated in certain societies. He talks there about the American Indians and their death song and so on. But he ends the chapter, in the whole chapter, it's kind of a wandering chapter, and it kind of comes to this point at the end. And I think you can kind of see how much the whole chapter is actually arriving at this point where he says, but they'll never, these custom and fashion, these variations in particular usages, will never deviate too much from CJ, from respecting other people's stuff. And for one very simple reason, such a society wouldn't exist and be preserved. So he ends, it's like, just this, it ends like in a couple, 2 sentences with a very evolutionary argument about why, in fact, in most societies, although the forms of property, although the forms of messing with someone's property vary, CJ is like a universal in societies, although it takes different forms. And so in that sense, he says, I do think he says that societies, at least where there's not, that at least this tends to hold and emerge among equals.
So he predicted the fall of the Soviet Union before Mises, yeah.
Well, yeah. There's something to what you say, yeah, because he says it wouldn't survive if they really messed with this too much. Yeah, I'm not sure that answers your question. I don't know much about Kant. I do know a little bit about this connection. Kant liked Smith very much. He had his Liebling. What is Liebling, or what's that word? What's that mean? Does that mean lovely, my lovely, or something? My loved one. He said that. I was just reading that today, actually, in superb work by Knud Håkansson, who I met in Uppsala about 2 weeks ago. He was visiting SCAS. His work is terrific. I'm so sorry I was so late in getting to it. But anyway, yes, there is some of that, definitely. But my understanding is that in Kant, it's more like you get these universal laws kind of spelled out and legislated, as it were. Whereas Smith, it's more like you're trying to arrive at them, but there is a certain correspondence, I believe, and Kant uses impartial spectator language sometimes, so there is some connection there. Hawkinson talks about some guy, Koksegi. Actually, it's two guys. It's Heinrich and his son Samuel, but they're kind of merged into one. Because Samuel like edited his father's and then commented on it and revised it and blah blah blah. But this is also German, and the chapter that I read talked about this influence on Smith, and then how that similarity is or influence is actually seen in similarities between Smith and Kant. Is that it? One last question. Anyone else want to get in? Okay. Splendid. Thank you for your attention.